Okay, I think anyone? Someone? Anyone? Or if you can't hear me, will you write that? Yes, okay, awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, this is my first live, so we'll see how it goes. And hopefully everything will continue to work. I'm gonna just do a presentation with some slides, and then we'll do a Q&A through the chat. So I won't, excuse me, I won't be looking at the chat until it's time for Q&A. So I'll just be doing the little presentation with the slides, and then I'll stop, and then we'll use the chat for the questions. So if the audio is choppy, that's probably an internet bandwidth issue. So we'll do the best we can. I think probably you might have a problem with some of the slides too. Okay. I'm just going to get started. So I will put up the slides with a little picture-in-picture of me, if this all works. Okay. And just tell me if you can't hear me, but otherwise we're good. So this is one question that's come up. Why? Why am I even doing this presentation? A lot of you probably already know that this is a question that comes up a lot in a lot of different ways. Is what is the relationship, if there is, between Intrinzen and classic? Can you do Intrinzen and still do some classical things? Can you be doing pretty strict classical training and still do some Intrinzen things? Okay, that side of it, that's not what we're going to talk about. So what we're going to talk about is for the people who want to be doing following the movement science principles that are used in Intrinzen and still do some classical things. So that's who this is going to be for. Now, before we go any further, classical training, Intrinzen, Panther Flow, me personally, right? We all share the same very, very high level goals. So, and this is just some of them, right? We want a healthy moving horse. We want a horse that's in balance and that can be balanced. Although I think we define it differently. We want a horse that's agile, that can be light on his feet and easily move in any direction, which is the big reason why we personally want the center of mass weight shift back when needed for the horse to do a certain movement. And then a safe spine for a horse that's going to be ridden, that will, carry a load on his back. So we have the same goals. It's what happens after that where there's a huge issue. So I don't know, well over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I said Intrinzen is the opposite of academic art of riding, or really any classical variation, but this was specific to someone who was doing the academic art of riding. And I haven't changed my view of that, because I haven't figured out how we could have those movement science principles, modern movement science principles. The underlying assumptions are so not just different, but opposite from classical training. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still things we can do. And it certainly doesn't mean there's anything wrong with academic art of riding. So just because we think that it's not consistent with modern movement science, And why should it be? That doesn't mean it's bad or wrong. It obviously works for a lot of people. But you'll see where we have to make some differences. So I said you can't do both because they're opposites. But what I meant by that was that if you are following the Intrinzen movement science principles, there's no way that you could also be following all of the principles, not be possible to be consistent with both. And I'll talk about that in a second, about why that is. But what I meant is that if you don't modify the way in which you do classical training, so I didn't mean you can't modify it. In fact, modifying is exactly what this video is about, or I should say this presentation live, because you absolutely can. But when I've described that, people have said, well, then it's not really classical training, is it? And that's right, it's not. Or if you modified the principles of Intrinzen in some of the core areas, then it wouldn't actually be Intrinzen. So that's what I meant, is that if you're following those principles, and I'll talk about what that is in a minute. So here's what I meant. If you think about opposites, right? Here are two opposites, two opposite colors on the color wheel, right? So what happens if you put those together? Well, I think this is the intention that a lot of people had when they said, well, I just want to pick and choose some of the things from Intrinzen and put it into my classical training. And when you blend two opposite colors, you don't get some of each. You get a mixture. In this case, it's brown. So Marika de Jong, she does the straightness training program, which is a variant of, I think, academic art of writing. I think she put it really well. She said, she was quoting some other proverb or something. If you chase two rabbits, you won't catch either of them. And I think that applies when you're doing something that's based on opposing theoretical principles. And the biggest issue is, of course, and we'll talk about this in more detail, classical training is based on the assumption that there is a correct way to execute a movement, and that the other movements that are incorrect should not be done, should not be trained, should not be reinforced, and the horse should be corrected from doing those over time. And of course, we believe exactly the opposite. So if you were doing Intrinzen, and people who have left Intrinzen sort of officially to either return to or to pursue, for example, a classical training or academic art of writing, they've done it for the right reasons, and they have stated, I can't continue to do Intrinzen because I don't think it's appropriate to reward or reinforce or support my horse doing movements that are not correct. Well, in Intrinzen, the modern science principles that we use would claim that's the opposite of what you should do, and that's not healthy. So we intentionally must reinforce and reward and encourage and support all of those other movements. And if we don't, well, then we're not following the movement science principles. So that's sort of what I meant. So if they're opposites, it doesn't mean you can't be consistent with the science and still do some classical things, right? People, you shouldn't have to feel that you have to give up everything to be consistent with the science. But it does mean that you have to modify it. So in that case, to really honor classical training, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying this really modified view is classical training. I would say that it borrows inspiration and ideas and maybe even some practices from classical, but it's not itself classical training. So you can do things, and we'll talk about how. And yes, that includes writing, even writing with a bit, if that's what's something that you actually really want to do, or that's required, for example, in a competition. It's not about what you do when the horse actually already owns the movements. It's about how you got there and what you do if the horse is resistant or struggling or has any problems or needs to be still told how to move. That's where the problem is, not if the horse can already do it. So, to be consistent, this is the easy answer, and then we'll dive in a little bit. We can borrow the what, a lot of the what, from classical training, what being the movements, maybe some of the aesthetics, etc., but throw away the how to get there. And I really mean completely ignore the how to get there, because it's the how, not the what and not the goals. It's the how that is completely opposite in terms of the movement science. Now, of course, this is the most appropriate thing to say. Classical training's been around for hundreds of years. Yes, it has. And Intrinzen has been around for, 5 minutes. But we're not talking actually about Intrinzen. That's just the label that was put on the project that first, I think, communicated some of these ideas, plus the intrinsic motivation and all of that, but they all work together. But it's not Intrinzen versus something else. It's about the movement science principles that are behind what Intrinzen does. So Intrinzen is just one example, and the examples of people doing it, including me, are themselves just examples of possible ways to follow the science principles. There is no method in Intrinzen, and it looks like it. So I think a lot of people will say, including me, right? I take a little bit from different methods. I don't follow any one method. And a lot of people, I think, believed that Intrinzen was itself a method, but it's not a method. We just give some examples, and lots of people have come to do some similar things, but only because they're convenient or because there's sort of some easy patterns that have emerged, not because it's part of a method. There's absolutely nothing in Intrinzen that anyone has to do Intrinzen. Intrinzen is more about, here are the assumptions from science, and as long as you're not violating those, it doesn't really matter. So some people have thought, well, I'm going to do classical training, but I'm just going to use completely, positive reinforcement. So, which I think is awesome. That's completely not Intrinzen because it's not using the movement science principles. So Intrinzen doesn't even specify positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. It just doesn't specify any of that. It's just that it's by far the easiest and most convenient way to do some of these things, to help the horse understand the communication that we're going to use, not so we can shape any of its movements. Okay, so this is not a criticism. This is just a fact. Classical training is not based on modern movement science. It couldn't possibly be, because it's been around for a long time. And when I say that, I mean my profession, when I was in the human movement profession and trying not to be bitter about my 5 years of university, 30 years ago, we studied for 5 years, and then I worked another 10 years doing things that were also not based on modern movement science. Because most of the real progress and the dramatic changes in movement science, well, they started long ago, but mainly they've happened in the last 30 years, some in particular because of the strong influence of, for example, pain neuroscience, which is just one piece. Those have happened in the last 10 years. So there's no way that really any form of training that science. And again, that doesn't mean that it's inherently flawed, because What's absolutely amazing is how these experts and old masters were able to intuitively figure out so much. But like everything that's happened, in the last 100, 200 years, there are many things that we intuitively got wrong in 100,000 different ways about the world. And the most complex thing, on the planet, of course, is the inside of a living biological creature, a mammal with a functioning nervous system. We still only know a tiny about, but what we do know has shown us that some of what we did, we intuitively got right, and a few things we got absolutely wrong. And this turned over the practices that were used in physical therapy, chiropractic, a lot of manual therapy in a profound and deep way. So this revolution, of course, I've talked about this. This has already happened in the human movement world in a lot of different ways. They're still coping with this, but they're way, way ahead of where the equestrian world is in reflecting or applying what's been learned. So let's talk about that. Because yes, even though it's been working for hundreds of years, what we believe the science is telling us is that there are much more efficient and effective, potentially healthier ways for the horse to learn and practice and develop movement. But lots of people are really successful with all the variations of classical training. So this presentation is not for people who are already doing classical training and like it and it works, right? You should just stop now because there's nothing here that would be useful. So this is for people who, again, want to follow the movement science, but still want to do some classical things. So here's the easiest way, again. Anything the horse can already do without being told how to move a body part. Now, this is important because we can tell the horse what we want him to do, but the what cannot include how to organize any body part. And that means the head, the legs, nothing. We can't tell the horse how he should bend, but we can tell him what we want. And if he's already doing a movement that is capable of the bend that we would like, instead of pulling any strings to get it, we help it emerge through activities, and then we put it on a cue. The fact that we develop it that way or that we test it that way, that tells us the horse owns it. And of course, when you use modern movement science, you don't first use any gear or tools to get the horse to move his body part a certain way, because that would be taking away the nervous system's solution. So first, and we'll talk about this, we find situations and activities in which the nervous system will make 100% of the choices for how to organize every single body part, all of them, which is why we don't hold the cavesson at the nose. Doesn't mean we can't use the cavesson. We just don't use it to influence a body part. Then once we know, we see, the horse has that as one of his solutions, we can put that exact solution on a cue. But of course, we still want to keep all the other solutions. And I'll give the example I always give, which is shoulder in. But at some point we can say, okay, horse, that one solution that you have, that we have for this one cue for it, now I want you to do that one. But he still has all the other ones as well, right? We're not trying to converge. So that's a huge difference. So this is really the I think, deepest difference between classical and the movement science principles is that classical training doesn't just specify the what, it specifies the how. And that the how is a direct training, guiding of the movements that we want, rehearsing those movements, practicing, and that through that, the horse will develop then the ability to do those movements on his own. And we think that is exactly backwards. So that's what we don't do. Now, the what, again, and there's no way in this amount of time I can actually explain all of the science reasons why this is so, but it must be a whole body always. The entire body is being solved by the horse's nervous system. So that's why we don't step in and influence anything. If the horse needs a reminder to get into a position, he doesn't automatically choose to step under, for example. We would never use a whip or even a cue to influence the body part, because that tells us that the nervous system has already decided against doing that. So now there might be an exception if the horse just didn't understand our cue and he actually thinks he's doing a different movement. But if the horse thinks he's doing the movement, but he's just not doing it the way that we want, we're not ever going to step in and tell any of his body parts how to do it. We're going to design a scenario where the horse's own nervous system figures out that that is a useful solution. That's how the horse comes to own it. So this is one of the big problems that you see, I think, when with people who are not all that successful with classical training. Again, tons of people are, but lots of people aren't. And one of the ways that you can absolutely tell that lots of people aren't is because they still have to use the bit and the whip, not just for communication, but or not just for communicating the what of the movement, but they're using it to also communicate and influence how to do it. If the horse owns it, there would never be a need to help remind him how. So that's why we're going to do things in a completely backwards way. So we just want the horse to have this, big movement toolkit, and it will include some things that classical training, and again, there are many forms of classical training and they don't all agree on everything. But let's say they've decided, these are the correct ways to execute a movement. And of course, it's different for every horse, but there is a correct biomechanics template. And everything else every other variation of that is incorrect. So we just say none of those are incorrect. They're all just solutions. But we're going to take the one, if we want to do some classical stuff, we're going to take the one that classical training or whatever discipline we're doing, or maybe the one the judge wants to see. If you notice, I'm wearing my show coat. And we're going to put that one on a cue so that when we want it, we can get that one solution out of the whole big toolbox. So this is kind of where we start to see the opposite. And again, I know a lot of you already know all this. So classical training says, all right, let me see if I can actually make this work. We'll say, here are the movements that are correct. And all of this, all the possible movements the horse can make, those are the incorrect movements. So the correct movements are the ones that live in there. All the other movements are, quote, incorrect. So you would never want to train those. You don't want to reinforce them. And often you want to or need to correct them. Okay, so the part there's like, go there. Those are the ones you're trying to get rid of, where things like crookedness and on the forehand and every other thing lives. So the modern science principles are going to say, here's all the possible movements Here's maybe a few that are kind of might be in some situations, and this is whether you're talking about horses or humans, some situations under extreme loads, for example, and I mean extreme, I don't mean just a rider, we maybe wouldn't want to do without preparation or something like that. But everything else, they're all within the horse's normal, healthy range of motion. And again, I think one of the negative side effects that's come out of a lot of classical training is we have, and often for good reason, but just the wrong understanding of movement, is that we've said, well, all these movements are, quote, bad. So, for example, the biggest example is behind the vertical. And people will give you all sorts of reasons. And there will be biomechanics explanations, but they completely fall apart outside of the training scenario of things like Rollker and horses that are being trained through pressure to shape their body. So going behind the vertical is an absolutely normal movement for a horse, and it's not a movement that in any way is harmful. Now, any movement, though, can be harmful if it's combined with some movements that are hurting the horse's back. So, for example, if the horse is doing it under a rider and he's having to compensate everywhere else, or if the horse is just straining and holding a fixed position. And of course, Rollker is just wrong on every level. So we're not talking about that. In fact, that's part of the problem, is that because we're so afraid of Rollker, any horse going behind the vertical in complete freedom is automatically makes you kind of feel not good. So, and I think I mentioned this once before. I won't go into the details, but long ago, some classical folks were very much criticizing my horses because they would see examples of them behind the vertical. And they used Dr. Nancy Nicholson's, her book, Dressage Biomechanics, and her pictures and descriptions. They used that to criticize my horses. So, of course, I come from a science background. I just wrote to her, and she was so gracious to start, a long-term correspondence with me. But the very first thing she said, well, I'll say it kindly, is these people are idiots. And she said the main problem is they're not looking at the whole horse. So she looked at all the pictures. And again, then we continued to talk long after that and said, the horse is getting the job done. If it happens that his head is behind the vertical, but he's doing all the other stuff that you want, and that's the natural result, he's getting the job done. There's nothing wrong there. And then, of course, she's part of what sent me down this path that I've been on. But I think it's that idea of you got to look at the whole horse and think, well, wait, the horse is meant to do all of these things. But the biggest problem, and the one, of course, that the movement science principles address, is that the healthy movement has a very different definition. We think, even coming from the biomechanics labs, but I don't mean equine biomechanics necessarily, but the people who are studying at the highest levels movement at every possible way that you could imagine. And of course, you already know what I'm going to say, that it's about movement variability. And we'll call it functional variability, meaning not any kind of variability is useful, but any variability within a range that can still get the goal, the movement goal, which is what is that movement trying to actually do? Not how does it look, not what are the angles of the joints, but movement has a purpose. Can it execute on that purpose? And then any variability and more variability around that execution of purpose is incredibly healthy because it's protective. So that's one of the things. And it allows the movement to be. So Yeah, I talked about that. We take the classical desired movement, put it on a cue, then we can do however we want. So this is the main one, is that we don't believe that the science any longer supports the idea that there is these movements are correct and the others are not. Or some people will just say, this is healthy movement, this is not. So there are things that we would consider unhealthy, and I'll talk about that. But they have, with a very small exception, they're not about the biomechanics. Now, our definition, well, it's not our definition, but we'll say it's coming from the movement science principles, is that having that variability, which means you can have robust movement, that would be healthy movement. So movement that is too consistent, that's converged on this is how you do this movement, which is a part of what a correct biomechanics mindset is actually trying to do, to converge on that correct movement. So we believe that's exactly the wrong thing to do, because it's, for one thing, there's some evidence that if the body has the ability to have good functional variability for a movement and is currently using that variability, that is what offers a protection from overuse, repetitive stress, which still is considered the number one cause of sport horse injuries. So, and those of you who've seen this, look at Nikolai Bernstein's famous study on the blacksmiths. Gives you a really good idea. Okay, so we want the horse to have a big, robust toolkit that will include the incorrect movements. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, yeah, but what about movement efficiency? And the biomechanics studies are meant to say this is the most efficient movement. It can generate what we need with the lowest amount of force. Well, I'm going to talk about that because that's a whole other question. First of all, now I won't go into the details, but we have to look at, do those biomechanics studies actually tell us what we can, how that movement was generated? And is it really telling us that that is a movement that uses less force, for example? If you look at a lot of the biomechanics studies, they're done on cadavers, they're done on computer models, or they're done with an extremely limited, and sometimes because they have to be for the science, extremely rigid and consistent movement, like on a treadmill or in one particular place. They have nothing to do with real world movement. So that's one huge problem. And that they're looking at only some aspects of the body. And of course, we're looking at the nervous system has to organize the entire body to do any movement at all. And then the other idea is, because when I was in school, of course, that's how we learned it too. Correct biomechanics only, we're going for movement efficiency. Then what we realized is that some of these movements we avoided because they add more load. Of course, now we're like, that's why we need to practice those movements, the ones that put on more load, for both safety, but also the adaptation that we're looking for. So that's what I'm saying. It's really the opposite. It's the opposite of how I learned it. And that was not easy for me either. So classical wants to use the correct biomechanics. The movement science principles now say we want movement self-organization. And that has been a confusing term for people. We'll come back to that. But I just want to very quickly flip through some pictures, because I'm going to show you that almost every picture and video that I have ever posted is technically incorrect. So, and I used to get called Facebook forums, but I want you to think about what this means, that all of these pictures and probably everything I ever show is technically incorrect. I'm not going to talk about why. I'll leave that to you. I will go through these pretty quickly. Some will be very obvious why they're incorrect, some not. So, okay, totally incorrect. That's incorrect. Ah, whoops, sorry. That's incorrect. Although it's the fabulous, unbridled goddess, Tara. She's never incorrect. Incorrect. Oh, incorrect. And let's see, dangerous. Ooh, extremely incorrect. Incorrect, dangerous. Incorrect, dangerous. Just incorrect. Incorrect, maybe for subtle reasons, but it's there in that picture. Incorrect. Now, this is an interesting one because he's actually an adult. So this one, it's not necessarily biomechanically bad. So this one I wanted to throw in, it's incorrect because, but this is another example of how we define correctness and then does it really match the real world? Because this is a told technically isn't supposed to have 3 feet on the ground at any one time. A told is supposed to be 1 foot, 2 foot support. So this is technically a faulty told. But if you wrote it, if you heard the beat, right, it's absolutely dreamy. It's what you would want. And it's what a lot of people actually will even ride in a competition, but technically it's not a tolt because at this time there's 3 feet on the ground. If he puts a lot more energy into it or goes faster, then we get to 1, 2. And this is just to show you that I have been incorrect for 40 years. So this was me 40 years ago, still incorrect, right? So I'm probably not going to get any better. Now, people will often say, well, yeah, but it's a work in progress. You can fix that. And of course, I'm never going to try to fix that. This is exactly what I'm trying to train for. So none of these things are mistakes. So I talked about this, the leading cause of injury in sport horses is thought to be, and you can look at, I think, any equine exercise physiology textbook to get this information. It's still thought to be cumulative microtrauma, and correct biomechanics doesn't prevent that. It doesn't help. So, well, I should say sometimes it might, but we're going to talk about that. So remember, we have the same goals. This is where it gets completely different and opposite, is that we have the same goals, but the assumptions about how movement actually works. So classical training is absolutely consistent and correct with its assumptions, which is, again, exactly how we trained humans for a long time. And that didn't go very well, and which is why there have been such big changes. The current movement science principles, which of course those are going to change too, but right now, those are based on a completely different assumption about how movement works. And when you have that assumption, that drives everything else that you're going to do. So again, classical training also has methods. We don't exactly have methods, but we have suggestions and ideas and techniques that other people have used, but they're just suggestions. They're absolutely nothing is part of the method. So let me just take you through an example with crookedness, because this is, again, a really obvious one. The assumptions in classical training would be that crookedness is a problem that needs to be corrected. And I'm not talking about a very small amount of asymmetry. I think everyone accepts that is natural. That it is almost always represented by stiffness on one side and then one weak hind. And it's correct through supple and strengthening that weak hind. Principles that we use would say, no, crookedness is not a problem that needs to be corrected. It's literally the solution. It's the nervous system's best answer, given everything that it knows, and it knows way more than we do. So it's the nervous system trying to protect the horse. And we will often never know why, that the nervous system has chosen to use that stiffness and weakness, which is almost never actually weakness. So if we say stiffness is a protection, and that resisting taking more weight on that hind leg is a protection, again, it doesn't mean that the way to train that would be to strengthen that leg, because there's some other reason the nervous system is not wanting to take more weight in that way, in that exercise, on that leg. And we don't know what that reason is, but trying to guide the horse into, doing it through actually manipulating where his leg goes to actually make him do that weightlifting, that would work perfectly if that really was the problem. So if it wasn't coming from the nervous system, if it really was just tissue weakness, then it would work almost immediately. And within 4 to 6 weeks, that horse should never, ever, ever need any more reminders to take more weight, because it would be done. It would already be able to do it. So the fact that it still continues to be a struggle is our biggest clue that most of the time it's not actually because that leg is weak. And no matter how much we try to strengthen it or even do strengthen it, it's not going to change the ultimate reason. So, and same thing with suppling. So we don't see it as anything we're going to correct. So our goal is to help the nervous system feel less need to be protective. And we also believe that there's no way to do that by simply proving to the horse by asking him to move his body in a certain way. That doesn't convince the nervous system, oh, see, I can put weight on that leg, because we have artificially, mechanically manipulated the movement. It's not being organized. It's not being coordinated through the entire body. It might look the same on the outside, but internally, the way the nervous system is organizing that movement could be profoundly different in every possible way. And those ways really, really matter. So that's the problem. We can't just produce the movement artificially and repeat it and then say we've got it. We can train that as a behavior, but now we've taken away the nervous system's earlier solution, which was its best solution, and we've now forced the nervous system to come up with other compensations because we took its favorite one away. So we have to get back to, why is the nervous system organizing movement in this persistently crooked way? So we're going to approach it in such a different way. And one of those ways is, not only are we never going to correct crookedness, we're going to try to sometimes make it even worse as part of a strategy to help the nervous system. That's a whole other thing. But we're definitely not going to correct it. But what we want is for the horse to, keep that crookedness, but wow, let's explore crookedness in the completely opposite direction as well. But again, we're never going to get there by manipulating the body into physically looking like it's doing what we want. It's got to be up to the nervous system. And if we have influenced any one part of the body, we've already taken away its ability to self-organize. And now it's just going to compensate with the rest of the body. So, for example, what's used most often in most forms of classical training is we're going to do lateral movements to help the horse be more straight, to be less crooked. Because if the horse is doing, for example, a shoulder in, we're going to get suppling, and he will have to take more. What you'll see is that I'm not actually asking him to do it at all. I'm not telling him to do the bend. I'm not asking that hind leg over there to come in. I'm just sitting there and sort of saying to him, yeah, we're doing that one thing that we do sometimes. And so it's important to know that, first of all, Dramer was never, ever taught successfully to do shoulder in. And you'll see that in a minute. But many, many professionals tried. But when he was allowed to develop it himself as one of his possible solutions, you'll see how that works. So, in classical principles, we would teach the correct bend and stepping under through some lateral activities, which again are often they will help strengthen that hind, and they might, unless you're holding the horse's head. If you're holding the horse's head into any bend, you're almost always training the exact opposite muscles that you want, because there will be some level of resistance to that. If there was no resistance happening, you wouldn't actually need to do that. Now, if you lift it up, but you're not putting any pressure on it, and you're using it as a cue to say, that thing you do where you do that, but you're not actually manipulating his body at all, then he's not developing resistance. So in the movement science principles, we would say, no, we're not going to try to get the horse to bend. We're not going to try to get the horse to step under, to take more weight. None of those things mean anything to the nervous system. We're going to say, what movement problem to the horse, what movement goal, what movement purpose does the nervous system perceive? What problem does it solve for the horse? And that's how we're going to, quote, train it, by setting up those problems, letting the horse solve them. And again, these are not behavioral. What does the trainer want? How do I organize the rest of my body when you've already taken some of those solutions away? That's not going to help. But after the movement is already developed and owned by the horse, we can put a bit in his mouth. I mean, if the horse agrees, we can sit on him, we can cue, it might not look any different from a movement that was developed in a traditional way, but how we get there is so very different. So classical training will very often use the cavesson, so that you hold here. I mean, gently. This is not abusive in any way. So this is not about a moral obligation. But using it in a very gentle way to influence and tell the horse, this is how I want you to bend. And now do the rest of the movement. And often a stick is used to help remind the horse to do more with his hind end or that leg, which again, that is a big clue that the horse doesn't own that movement. Because if he did, he'd already be doing it. So if that was a well-trained movement, it would never need a reminder. The only time we would need, the stick would be not to cue how he does the movement, but just to cue the movement itself, to distinguish it from a different movement. So, I know that's a weird, hard thing to get your brain around, right? And people will look at, for example, Dramer and go, but who is built downhill on the forehand, and go, but how did you train him to reach more with his hind legs? How did you, none of that. I trained none of that. He trained himself through the activities. This is not easy. It's really fun though, but it's much easier to just say, I'm just going to tell him what I want him to do. And we're like, I need to come up with a puzzle, right? But it is a ton of fun, and it does get easier. So our job is to design scenarios where the horse wants to solve the problem. The movement purpose is go straight, but keep track of something over here. One of the ways that the horse is going to solve that on his own, I'm going straight, but oh God, I have to look at something over there because I got to keep track of you, because otherwise I won't know what you're doing, or maybe you're holding the food. The horse absolutely is going to figure out, based on a bunch of stuff, that 3-track shoulder in, shoulder in is going to be, which of course, a lot of classical training, I think most classical training, does not want you to do the leg yield, including explicitly academic art of riding does no leg yield, and doesn't want the horse to do. Of course, we do, because it's a great way to get adduction and abduction and a bunch of other stuff. But we don't want to train leg yield. We just want to know that that's one of the horse's possible solutions. And then because it can be so good for getting adduction and abduction, right? It's firing the mechanoreceptors, it's improving the cortical map, right? We love it. We're not going to train it. We just want to make sure the horse has that as a solution to go forward, but keep track of something over here. So if the horse really is typically does it with leg yield, because shoulder in is more effortful for him, at some point you're going to speed up and leg yield will no longer work. Unless you have a gaited horse, and then it might be incredibly fun, right? But so at some point, you're probably going to start to see shoulder in, even from a horse that you would swear cannot take weight on that weak hind or cannot bend in that way. But you give the horse a movement purpose, he'll figure it out pretty quickly. And then we can now we don't want to reinforce any one solution, or we're back in the same problem. So we're going to reinforce. This is why we do very, very messy, sloppy when we do positive reinforcement for movement, which is all we're talking about, because we don't want to shape or reinforce a specific movement. We want to shape and reinforce. Well, we don't want to shape. We want to reinforce trends, and trends that include all of the solutions. Now, very temporarily, I hate to say this, but yeah, we might temporarily for a week or two, maybe if you were going to do a dressage competition, you might more heavily reinforce one of the specific tools. I've done that, but because Stramer's been in a dressage show, but right after that, you want to make sure you get the other ones back. So, classical training will direct and reinforce only the correct 3-track shoulder in. And we won't go down the rabbit hole of when did 3-track shoulder in become the way to do shoulder in, right? At which old master did that happen, right? But let's just say that that's the one you want. Absolutely, you can get that. But we want to explore affordances to encourage all the different ways the horse might do it. Okay, so classical training, again, is about getting the correct movement through gentle instruction to fix the problem. We're going to say if we correct it, that will create new compensations, and those compensations will not be as good. They might look good to us, and a lot of veterinarians will say, when I go out on a call because the horse is injured, and it could be what looks like a catastrophic injury, oh, he just blew a tendon. A lot of times those veterinarians will say, what were you doing 3 months ago? Because that injury almost never happened in that moment. It was just the last straw of this movement that had been building up. This there was too much repetitive stress in a particular way. Now, let me show you something. If we want to do classical movement X, whatever it is, we're going to give the nervous system an authentic movement purpose for which X is chosen by the nervous system, the whole body. It's going to bring all of the resources into the body, which is why, again, if we step in and say, here's how I want you to bend. Let's say the horse is tipping his head, right? And we want him to bend here and bend this amount. Well, now the nervous system is not organizing and coordinating the entire body. And it can feel like, yeah, but he's doing most of it. Isn't he still compensating for that, not trying to solve a problem that is a movement purpose? This matters deeply to the brain, humans and horses. And even though I'm not going to go into the details here, it is probably the most robust, solid, really unarguable science in all of motor learning literature. Is the idea, what it often goes under the focus of attention, but it really means who is in charge of organizing and coordinating that movement. And it's either the movement system or it's something else. In a human, that could be because we're trying to think our way through a movement and tell ourselves what to do. With our athlete, it could be we're telling them how to move a body part, right? As soon as we do that, everything changes. And again, hundreds of studies. There's nothing I've ever seen in movement science that's more solid than this, yet we don't do it. So anyway, sorry. So I know this isn't going to work out really well to show video this way, but this is Dramer doing it when he already knows how to do it. I don't know if you'll be able to see this. You may have seen this in the past from me. This is how it all starts, though. She's just, you don't even need plus R. Well, she's carrying a bucket of food, and then she runs up the hill. But he's got to keep track of her. So now he's like, oh, I have to go forward, but I have to keep track of her. This is a very pacey horse. This is one of the ways that we can, break up the toll. But if you sat there and put all the gear on the horse and said, which people did for years, you had to muscle him in to the bend and to stepping under and constant reminders. But when he has a movement problem to solve, well, the movement system knows exactly what to do. This is another example. Don't know if you'll be able to see this one through the magic of the internet, but this is the same thing. Apologize for the words. This was for a video I made for something else. But he's using the environment and the task. He wants to get ahead of her, but he knows that she's going too slow. And if he gets too far ahead of her, he's not doing the game, right? She's not asking for the bend. She's not asking for anything about that tolt. He just knows that the game is keep track of me. The fence line and the task, which means the game, right? There's no task that says bend this way. The bend is automatically organized by the horse's movement system trying to do it. And then now she runs ahead, of course, and he has to run. So this is the question we get most. All right. But what's the big deal? If I just use the cavesson for a bend? Well, I'm going to always ask, why would you? Because you have to ask, what problem are you really trying to solve for the horse? What problem does the nervous system think it's solving? What's your long-term goal for doing that? And it makes sense to say, can't I just give the horse a little bit of help? And again, there's no harm in trying that. And if it works, and like I said, within 4 weeks, the horse needs absolutely no further reminders, then it did work. The horse was already able to do it. You were just getting him to actually go, oh, I got it, right? We still wouldn't do it that way, but there's no problem. It's just that we're talking about, I don't know what the percentage is. I'm going to say maybe 90% of the times that doesn't actually really solve the problem. And again, there's a pretty legitimate reason why it doesn't. But it's possible that you're training a horse that already does own the movement. But in which case you'll know really quickly, because then you could just do it with a simple cue very quickly within, a few days. That horse would just be going, oh yeah, I totally do this. I step under, I bend like that, no problem. And then you just cue it. But if you have to keep reminding the horse, step under, step under, step under, take weight with that hind, engage the hind. Oh, he's not doing the bend, right? If there's any struggle, your brain is protecting the horse from you. And that's really, we have to get the nervous system as our friend. So self-organization is binary. It's either all or nothing. It's either the nervous system is choosing every particle in the horse's body to solve the problem. We control the task. We control the goal. We control the environment, but we don't control what movements the horse makes to solve it. Now, some of the people who are really the researchers and experts in this will say there is a way in which you could control the environment and the task, the game, so that there is only one perfect solution and it's the one you want. But then you've completely missed the point. So some of you may have seen Nemo, my new horse, who doesn't know really anything, but he's awesome. So it was my third time just showing him the target. And I, stood where I normally stand, back behind his shoulder, reached the target over, and he, bent around and touched it. Awesome. And then I immediately brought it to the other side. And instead of, reaching back closer to his body to touch it that way, he sat there, and then he just backed up. And then it was really easy. And it was like, okay, that's a solution. So if I said, yeah, but then how am I going to get him to do it in other ways? Well, that's really easy. I'm just going to keep changing the circumstances, but I'm never going to tell him, oh, that's a bad solution, or that's not the solution I wanted. It's just a perfectly reasonable way he solved it. But now I want all the possible solutions. So again, what's the big deal if the horse just solves 90% and we've helped him with the 10%? Well, same thing. We just have to say why. What problem are we really trying to solve? And if we just want to mechanically get the horse to do the movement we want and repeat it, then sure, that totally works. That is how classical training works. But that's not the goal that we're shooting for. So we're going to not direct any body part to move a certain way, because that stops the nervous system from, and I don't want to just say the nervous system, I mean the whole body. There's all kinds of weird stuff going on in movement that's awesome. And it's not just coming from the brain. Sometimes the brain isn't even really involved. But the nervous system is sort of touching and influencing everything. But also just the joint couplings. There are movements that will just happen anyway. And we want all of those things to be happening as authentically as possible. Then if we want, again, once they have emerged, we want to just be, now we're in exercise physiology land. And you've probably heard me talk about this. Exercise physiology land is a great place to be, because it means all we're trying to do now is just increase a little bit of the endurance, maybe increase a little bit of speed, maybe increase a little bit of power, right? We're just working on the tissues and the energy systems for that movement that the horse already does. So the problem with a lot of riding is that, we're trying to do all of those things at the same time. We're trying to actually get a movement the horse is already resisting, and we're trying to be in exercise physiology land, and it just doesn't usually work out well at all. So that's why it can be so easy once the horse owns it on the ground, put some weight on his back. Often, if it's done sort of at the right time, excuse me, you put weight on the horse's back and he'll do it even better. Because he's already learned how to organize a movement. He's become a movement problem solver, not what we'll call a movement solution repeater. And that matters to us. So we're not going to direct the body parts. So again, I know I keep going over this. It feels like it should be no big deal to just help the horse out a little by telling him to bend or by reminding him to step under. But it is a really big deal to the nervous system. Is it going to hurt the horse? Well, no, definitely not. But it's not going to further the kind of long-term goals that we have for the horse. And it may only help to make the horse actually more fragile, but fit, but fragile. So it makes a lot of sense if you really understand the science, but you don't need to. You don't need to understand the science if you accept these assumptions. But if people are doing classical training, they're often trusting that those assumptions about how movement works, which we now know are not accurate, that those assumptions were correct. So again, an explorer, and you've probably seen this. I don't know if this will show up. Movement puzzles that cause the horse to have to do all sorts of things, including taking more weight to the hindquarters, and moving in all sorts of different ways, and I'm not telling them how. So now, again, did I ask him to go into this position where he had to lift up and then step forward? Yeah, but I didn't actually direct his body parts to do it. I said, if you can solve this problem, lifting up through the withers, but again, that one is probably the closest to a micro-shaped thing, but we don't. We actually say, I'm putting this thing above you, and can you touch it? It's a movement goal. And then he knows he's going to step forward, but the downward slope is the best way, for the most part, to help the horse start to learn to step more under, to take more weight on the hindquarters, to be able to use his front legs. And okay, let's see, how about this one? This is another example. I know you guys have seen this, my little tiny dojo. There's things that are happening just because of the walls and because of how small it is. So I'm not telling him how to move his body at all, but the walls are automatically doing the work. But because I'm not telling him how, and separately from that, because we're working on his motivation, I have to wait for him to decide. You can see this is a normal trot, right? It's not a big fancy trot. And he's a 5-gaiter. He's 21, I think. So he slowly starts to come more up. But part of what's driving that is if he starts to go bigger and he has to constantly manage these corners, there's a corner everywhere, every moment. He can't be continuing to be heavy on the forehand and make those corners. I'm not telling him to do anything. I'm just waiting for him. He knows the kind of game is go big, but it's the walls that are doing all of the work. And his nervous system is just simply organizing around that. So, of course, our whole goal is, and I would say the art is about being a designer. And I'll come back to that. So if the horse truly owns a classical movement, a movement that classical training has decided is correct, or you're going to show it, right? Then you can ride it. I mean, if the horse agrees, you can put a bit in his mouth. He can carry it, right? This is a picture of Dalia Yin Yang horses on Instagram who came to spend time here, and she would just not pick up the reins. She would not. I liked riding and still do. I mean, a bitless bridle because I don't feel I'm competent with my hands to use a bit. And what would I use a bit for? There's nothing I could use a bit for. So he has a nice soft bitless bridle, but I still like to ride in contact. But Dalia just wouldn't. So and Dramer was so happy because she just would just throw the reins away no matter what, right? But every movement that she rode, every movement you could ever want, he already does. He's not ridden very often, but he does so much on the ground, and it's just, okay, now she's up there. Yeah, now I have tack on. We do a lot of stuff where the horse is doing stuff on the ground, but he just happens to have the saddle on. So, they get used to the weight, but that's just an exercise physiology thing, not a can the horse carry himself in that position. So it becomes a really easy thing to do. Or this last summer, Hazel on Dramer. And again, this is not something you learn to do panther walk. And then because I'm there, line there, right? And he's trying to stay with me. He's making these lateral movements himself, which for those of you who do panther walk, you probably know at some point it becomes much easier for a horse that's typically on the forehand to do a lot of these movements in panther walk because they automatically have to be more organized to do it. So they suddenly, and it frees up a lot of their movement potential because they have to take a little bit more weight back. They have to be more elevated. So that was just a little example. So you already know, this is our main philosophy. Believe in nature, believe in the horse. And the way that we do this is we want to honor the horse's true nature and the brilliance of the movement system. because it's so much more capable than anything that we could possibly ever know about how a body should move. And again, there is so much science behind this. It's really not something that you can explain without a whole lot of time. In fact, some of the research on how movement emerges is all the way over here coming from robotics. But the absolute latest in artificial intelligence and robotics, where you've probably seen how much trouble that these scientists have had. If we knew so much about biomechanics and movement, why was it so hard to get an actual robot modeled after human joints and things to be able to move? Why was it so hard to teach them to move? And then they were so fragile. So the way that they've been able to do it very recently is kind of mind-blowing, but it has to do with almost exactly what we've been talking about, where they let it explore on its own and it teaches itself. Okay, so let's do Q&A, and hopefully this will work. And I will go back to big. Okay. Thank you for putting up with that whole long presentation. I'm going to try to read the chat. So if you have a question, if you could start it by just putting a Q or the word question, so that I'll know that that's a question you're asking. And I don't see any questions. So if someone has a question or a comment, it doesn't have to be a question. Can you just transfer what we learn in human movement science to horses? Yeah, almost entirely. For a bunch of reasons. So for one, just looking at exercise physiology, and you'll see if you study equine exercise physiology, most of the assumptions, except where the organs are fundamentally different in a few areas, but most of the fundamental assumptions are saying, look, this is how it works in human movement. We're going to assume it's probably similar unless we find otherwise, because there's so much more research going on. So a lot of physiology, exercise physiology in horses, is just about comparative studies to say, well, here's how it works in humans, here's how it probably works in horses, and here are the few areas we know are different. The nervous system, this is the area where a lot of people go, well, but horse is so different. Can we use the nervous system? Well, yes. And in fact, if you look at pain science, and even what the pharmaceutical companies are doing, and research on memory, all of those things, right? The Nobel Prize winner in memory, Eric Kandel, studied memory in sea slugs because their individual neurons were big enough to see with the naked eye. And drug companies, and again, and other researchers, will first test things like painkillers, right, which are interfering with what's happening at the synapse, for example. A fruit fly has enough similarities in their nervous system to be a useful model to start pursuing science in human nervous system work. And then they move up to, for example, a rat or something like that. We know horses have all of the same neural architecture for pain, their mechanoreceptors, right? We didn't used to know that. For example, the study on hooves from Bowker. If you look at Bowker many, many years ago, their ability to research the mechanoreceptors in the hoof was very limited. So they found some of the same mechanoreceptors that humans have, but not all. And then with more recent technology, they were able to study the hoof and go, whoa, they have this huge, rich set of sensors in their hooves of all of the same zoo of different receptors that we have. But the systems are the same. Of course, where the big difference is is the prefrontal cortex that we have, and they don't have very well developed at all. But it's the prefrontal cortex that for performance and for healthy for any kind of movement, we're trying to keep that out of the way. So they have an advantage if we can just help them do that, right? We're the ones that have to tell ourselves to stop telling ourselves how to do it. Oh, hold your arm down like this. Do this 45 degrees, right? We know that creates all sorts of problems. Whereas if you're free to just go jump up and grab that thing, right? Now the movement system in your body will organize all of your resources to do that. But if you're starting to get involved and tell it what to do, you are the puppet master, and you're not going to be good at it compared to the nervous system. So yeah, we absolutely can. Let's see. Okay, sorry, I'm going back up to the... How do you reinforce one movement more without losing the others? Well, sometimes we do that intentionally to do something that we would use as a movement default in service of doing something else. One thing we try to do is still keep variability in that movement. So I'll just give you the example. If I want to work on tolt in a horse that's been trotting a lot, I'm going to temporarily set aside the trot and reinforce the hell out of tolt. Now, of course, I'm going to try to get as much variability as I can in it, but in the beginning, there might not be very much variability. And so I'm temporarily going to try to make that a strong default. Now, again, we're using complex dynamical systems theory for this. So if you're familiar with that, it has to do with attractor states. So we're trying to get a dynamic attractor state for something. Sometimes we have to first disrupt the one that's already there, which is also how we would, quote, correct something. Sometimes just by not doing it for a while, it gets the least amount of reinforcement. But normally we try to do it by just not putting them in a situation where that becomes the affordance, where that's the easy thing to do. So we try to put them in an environment or have tasks or challenges where they're probably not going to do that thing. Then once that starts to be strong and you've got enough variability in it, you can bring back the other things. They'll always come back. So in a way, I think we're often kind of playing with that edge of, ooh, I kind of over-reinforced that. And now that's kind of lost, but it's never lost. And you can always bring that back. So I do worry about that, though, with these very specific movements. Like when the only reason I have even, done reinforcement for shoulder in or even cared about it is just because, for valid reasons, people wanted to know, can you use this and do shoulder in or whatever, and it's like, sure, it's one of their solutions. He can do it. He can do all the things. So I'll just reinforce that just a little more. But I would find myself, or other things, right? When you're on Instagram, I would find myself, without even realizing it, tending to reinforce things that I knew other people would approve of. Not times. I will find myself reinforcing the horse in one direction more than the other, right? Maybe because of my own asymmetry. And if I don't pay attention to that, I'll start to realize, oh, we're doing a lot more this way than that way, which is one of the reasons I love fence lines. Because if you're on the other side of the fence, it absolutely guarantees that you're working on straightness because you're going in both directions. The horse has got to bend and organize himself to keep track of you. So it's like, if I had a fence line and a tub of food and part of that fence line was on a slope, I could do almost anything, right? A phenomenal amount of training, because we're not training it, but the nervous system can do an incredible amount with that as the constraint, because we're using environment and task constraints, not restraining the actual horse. But the horse can have gear on. We can have gear on to say, okay, but don't go out of this ring or don't go loose because the stallion's over there, but we're not influencing how he organizes his body part. We're basically just using it to put a barrier at the very end of what he's able to do, or because we are now communicating with him that way. So, uh, is there a possibility to design a context to give the horse the idea of travers? Yes, but it's funny because for a long time, I'm not very creative. I watched my horses and watched my horses, and I swore that I couldn't come up with a good scenario. And then, if you know Lachlan from Emotional Horsemanship, he was on one of our Zoom calls, and he's amazing, and he does work with horses, and he does these incredibly steep rides. And he said, well, horses do that all the time when they're going down a steep hill. And as soon as he said it, it just, I realized, of course they do. So that is just one example, and I'm sure there are a lot of others. It could be possible to do it with a hip target, but if I absolutely had to, I might make an exception and go, okay, I'm going to be really careful about it, but maybe I'll do a hip target while he's going down here, but I'll do it with a lot of variability. That wouldn't be the worst thing to do. But again, there's a huge difference between a hip target, like just hit that, right? I don't care how you do it, but hit it, but you're not influencing any of the rest of the horse's body, but there might be a fence there, which causes him to move in a particular way, but you're not doing it. But I'm still not going to use that target to tell his hindquarters how to hit that target. But if he knows that the goal is just to hit that, right, that would be okay. I mean, it would be easy to cross a line on that, but if I really wanted to get it for a specific purpose, yeah, that could be possible. But it is true, when the horses go down a steep enough hill, that's how they do it. So it was kind of a fun one. Or there are some people who have so much of a kind of dance communication with the horse. I've talked about this before. The only person I've seen in person do it with my horses is Tara, Unbridled Goddess. I'll tell the story again, but it still amazes me. She was playing with Dramer, and she had him, doing all these awesome things. And then she said, oh, okay, now I'm going to get him to do some hunches in. And I went, no, he doesn't know that. We've never done that. And as I was telling her he doesn't know that and doesn't do that, he's doing it. And she's not touching him, but she's just, I don't know how she did it. But anyway, there are people who can have that kind of subtle influence with their body. And of course, the horses pick up on all those things. So, do I think classical training has always made this mistake? Some of it, but no. I think why classical training worked so successfully for such a long time is because so many of the people who were doing it hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they needed an agile horse. They needed a horse who wasn't, they could not rely on the horse to do what they asked and then, get him to, right? The horse had to do it automatically. He had to be naturally, reflexively able to balance, to be able to react, right? So that's the true definition of agility, means in unpredictable situations. Same thing with balance, right? Balance will not save your life if it has to be, if you have to help, right? Balance is what happens in the moment, that absolute moment when your brain can't even get involved. So we can't train it through these predictable trained movements. So yeah, I think there was so much else going on with the horse. I mean, a lot of the old masters, the horses were in harsh conditions, right? I mean, some of them were kept standing up, tied up in a little box was their living situation. But they had so much movement variability, so much variability in terrain, in situations, right? And then if they had a purpose. So I think, and you mentioned working cow horses. To me, cow horse is the closest thing I've ever seen to a horse that has both intrinsic motivation and killer self-organization. Just awesome. And our very first family horse was a former cow horse of my uncle's, and I had never experienced that feeling again, that feeling of what it's like on a horse that's actually in with the cows, where you're just a passenger, until way, way later. One time, when the first time I was ever on Vavi, when Stainer said, on the ground, Stainer said, "I'm taking over. You just back off and hang on." I mean, now we do it all the time, but I'd never done that before. And there was the moment where I felt Vavi realized, "Oh, I'm not paying attention to the rider. She's just, I don't know, she's just a bag of water up there. I'm playing the game with Steinar." And suddenly you feel that switch where the horse is suddenly, "I got this." And their movements are so agile and so incredible compared to what I could do if I was actually trying to generate those movements with my own body. But it doesn't mean that I can't then put them on a cue, which is how we do a lot of stuff. Um, when using a cue for a solution, how do you maintain movement variability for the movement suggestion? Or do you then accept losing variability? Yeah, well, so that's why I'm careful with clues. I say careful. I'm actually just really bad and sloppy about cues because I can be. And because, for example, most of the competition that I have done and would do again, by the way, is Icelandic sport. And, you're it's not like dressage where you have this long string of constantly different movements to show. And even Icelandic version of dressage is a lot more flexible. But you're really just showing these gaits. So you don't have to have very many cues. And there can be flexibility in them. But that's why we often call them clues. So if you are going to put a cue on a very specific tool in the toolbox, I think that's absolutely fine as long as you make sure that you can use other situations to have those other movements stay intact. So, because this is the simplest example, I'll use it, the shoulder in. If I'm going along the fence line and I'm having him keep track of me, a lot of times it's going to be a combination of my speed and my own bend and the terrain that's going to determine whether he's in a 4-track, 3-track, or leg yield, or just going straight, right? If he doesn't have a reason to keep track of you, he'll just go straight, or even be crooked the other way with his shoulder toward you, right? So that's why we start by saying, does the horse understand that, this game is he's got to just keep track of you, but we don't care how, as long as he can do it, right? And then you just start varying things. So if I wanted to put that specific 3-track shoulder in, I would already know what are the circumstances where that becomes his nervous system's sort of best solution. Probably, over reinforce it so that he knows that's the one I'm going to go to. I'm willing to take that risk because I know that all I have to do, because this has happened, is if I just go back to playing with my own speed and how far away I am, I can easily get, or be on the side of the fence with him, right? I can easily influence whether he's doing a leg yield or this perfect shoulder in. And once they own it and you have it on a cue, that's the thing, right? You don't have to rehearse it and rehearse it and rehearse it. You just have to be able to do it the amount of time you would need to do it in a competition or wherever you're going to use it, right? So you don't need to practice this very much. Once the horse can do it, it's just a little exercise physiology where you if he doesn't have the capacity to repeat it the number of times you're going to need. But, we're still just talking about playing with the dials a little bit, not a whole lot. Let's see. What do you do that your horses won't eat while going over grass? Well, everyone has their own way. If you ask me that in, what's the date? About 7 weeks, I will tell you that I won't be on the grass with them and trying to get anything done. I will be on something else, right? Or I'll be on lesser grass. I mean, there is a period of time. My horses are on grass 24/7, which is a problem and that I'm trying to fix for those 2 months of coming up. Just because it's not healthy. But they're on grass 24/7. And so I don't have an arena. I have my little dojo, which I only rarely use. So 99% of what I do is on the grass. But because they're on the grass so much, most of the time and most of the year, except that moment where the grass is just so compelling, they're happy to be involved. But I do use a lot of different tricks. I mean, sometimes it's because I have a very high value treat, and that might get them started. And then once they get started and they get some intrinsic motivation kicking in and nature's pharmacy starts to be not about the treat. But that might be the thing that draws them in the first place. If they're like, no, I'm good here eating this delicious grass, but maybe, right? A lot of times though, and I use this, it's because you get one horse and maybe I put the halter on and lead this horse over. I mean, if the horse is resisting and saying, no, I have to eat the grass, right? I'll let him. But a lot of my horses will go, okay, fine, sure. Because they know if they really put up a fight, I'll just let them go. I might halter a horse and walk him over to, the reverse round pen. Well, for example, if I go ask Dramer, hey, you want to play? Dramer will often go, no, I'm good. But if he sees me with any other horse, he will run over there and go, no, I'm better, I'm bigger, right? The stallion doesn't care about the state of the grass. If there's something to do, he wants to be involved. And the new horse, he doesn't even know whether there's what treats are about, or he just wants to be involved wherever anything is happening, right? It's Dramer who actually does the most, but he is like a cat. He's like, nope, not interested because you want me to be, right? But then 2 seconds later, he'll go, all right, now I've chosen to be interested. So I will use other horses if that's what's required. Or just other little tricks, right? If they're feeling good and I take them to a certain place on the grass where they start associating that area is really exciting. That's where we go fast. That's where we do the big stuff, right? Sometimes all you have to do is take them to that location and they already have such an association with the excitement that they just forget about the grass and, go for it. But also I just, I let them eat grass when they can. I mean, if they're not allowed to eat grass at all for health reasons, I'm not going to take them on the grass and try to have a fight with them. But a lot of people have solved that on like trail rides. If you look up that thing called grazing and racing, people do, and it's awesome. They've figured out all kinds of clever ways, but I'm not the best for that. Let's see. How do all those dressage horses still put up with all the -R in classical training? Is it because the nervous system sees no other options? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we can't generalize because, for example, my sister is a Grand Prix dressage queen. So she has this 17-2 giant, amazing, incredible horse. She's at a barn in Southern California that has had Olympic dressage horses. I mean, she's full on, right? But she's also the kindest person I know. And they do use -R, but she's the first person I think that kind of proved to me, long before my horses, that there could be intrinsic motivation with the extremely difficult movements. Because she would always say, when you get to the really, really hard stuff, suddenly you feel the horse, it becomes effortless. The problem is most horses don't get to that level, first of all. I don't know what the exact stats are, but in dressage, for example, the huge drop off is second level. So very few horses actually even progress up the levels or get to do the fun stuff where they might get some of those benefits, which is why, we turn the training scale. We don't have a training scale, but if we did, it would be completely upside down, right? We're going to do the agile, the collected stuff first because that's what the horse most wants and needs. But we're not going to train it with force where it would be dangerous. It's appropriate if you're using direct manipulation and training the body parts, and the horse doesn't really have a choice, it's appropriate to have that at the very highest end of your training. But because we're not doing it that way, we're letting the horse solve it. Well, horses are born doing that. They're doing that by day one. So we absolutely want that stuff first because that makes everything else easier and makes the horse feel a lot more self-confidence. That's what helps restore the joy in movement. Horses inherently want to be able to shift their weight back and really elevate with the front legs. That's rewarding on its own. But so many of them have forgotten or it's been taken away from them. But so I think there are a lot of people using -R, but if they're experts, like Steinar, he can use pressure and release in ways that I never could because he's so in tune with the horse that it truly does become that sort of holy grail of, the horse just, it always looked as though the horse just automatically went, yeah, I want to do this, right? And I think part of that comes from the way they train in Iceland out and with multiple horses. And the horse has so much freedom. But I could never do that. Even after, 40, 50 years of experience. There's no way I was ever going to have that skill. So, but I think a lot of people do. So if the horse is really happy, but you do see, of course, a lot of, even some of the people I follow on Instagram who I love, who are doing classical or academic writing, you will see them sometimes post that they are afraid of what will happen in their lesson. They are afraid the horse will explode. And not just, out of joy, but just that there will be, unpredictable amount of tension and they don't know what will happen, right? So, and I think, and these are people who train kindly, but you do see a lot of horses training in dressage where they do seem to explode out of nowhere. So when you see that, of course, that's because the nervous system felt like the consequence of exploding was still better than how much risk they believe they're under trying to do this. So yeah, it's to me, the sad part is that so much of this can happen without the horse ever having to go through that fearful, threatened feeling, right? Because we want to challenge the horses. We want them to feel like this is hard. This is a challenge, but it's not a threat. You guys are awesome. Let's see. I'm looking for another one. No, I definitely am not the person who does any of the singing. Or transforming the movements from pretty work to writing if you don't have a second person. Okay, this is something that we talk about in the course. There are a bunch of ways that you can do it. One of the things that I use, if I know that there's not going to be another person, I use environmental cues and or task cues. So, for example, when Dramer was first long ago coming kind of back to writing and he was already starting to do some of these fancy things, right? And he loves his fancy trot. That's what he started with. He didn't start with crunches or panther walk. He was like doing that trot for like a year before I did anything else. His cue for that on the ground it was kind of an accidental cue, but once I realized it worked, then I made it a cue, was to go over a ground pole. And then he would always do it as soon as he went over that one ground pole. So that, again, I didn't start out making it the cue, but it sort of became a cue, and then I reinforced it. So then on him, if you just pointed him in the direction of that ground pole, either he'd go into it before he got there or he'd just do it, because it was just an association. So that worked for him, for a whole bunch of other things, right? If you noticed in that one video, I'm showing, there's one location where I started out doing the quote shoulder in, along that one fence line. So the first few times I was trying to write it and put it on a cue, I just did it in the same location. And I'm not even asking him to do it. He just is like, oh yeah, this is what we do here. And then I was just kind of playing around with it. Now, once you have it, like once a Dramer was going over that pole, then I can transfer it to a body cue. And my body cues are so not subtle or accurate, right? They're very sloppy, but you know what it feels like. So I would just say, all right, if I want him to do that fancy trot from his normal default super low flat trot, I'll just pretend like I'm riding it already, and that became the cue. But I have a story where, so he had a dressage trainer for a while who's awesome. Many of you probably know who she is, Jack Ballou. And she helped me through a lot of the experiments when Dramer was first really starting to do the fancy stuff. So she would often ride Dramer and I would ride Vavi so that we could go out together. So one time, so every time when Dramer would do that fancy trot, if my husband was out there, he would go, "Oh, fancy," to Dramer. My husband's convinced that they like to be told that. So he would always do that. So one time Jack was out riding on Dramer and he was doing a really nice tolt. And our neighbor looked at Dramer and Jack riding and said, and he was doing a tolt. And the neighbor said, "Fancy." And Jack said, in a heartbeat, Dramer just immediately went into that trot, the fancy trot. So for him, of course, fancy became an association verbal cue, which was pretty funny. And I think some of you have seen how my cue for canter depart now is and. When the and was supposed to be the prepare for the canter depart cue, and became the canter depart cue. So yeah, I'm terrible about cues, which is amazing because that just shows you how robust this is. It can work anyway. Locations that you focus on, things where, and if I knew that I was going to start writing again, of course, I would do everything to make the transfer as no big deal as possible. So you've probably seen this. When we start to come back to writing, you'll probably see me do this in another month. I start by just doing the same stuff, but with the saddle, and then weights in the saddle. So by the time the person gets on, it becomes so easy for them. They know what to do. They know what your cues are in these locations. Then you can transfer them. Now, if I wanted rain cues, well, that's easy enough because one of the things you'll see us do a lot is that doing the ground stuff for a lot of reasons. We work back here so that you're in the position you would be in if you were in the saddle, but you're off the horse, but you're still there. So now the horse is actually perceiving you a little bit lower, but roughly in the, or yeah, there'd be no weight there. So you could, use the reins, for example, on the position. If you're delivering treats, you're delivering treats from that position. So the horse just, by the time you're up there, it's not a big deal. The other one I forgot to mention is if you use the gym mat, a lot of times the gym mat can be a cue for a whole bunch of stuff. Sometimes the horses just know, I'm going to go to the gym mat because I get to stand there and just do crunches, and that's awesome, right? But our horses would know that if we were going across the gym mat while they were riding, they would just automatically start having these bigger, bouncier movements. So it became an environmental cue, even though it was changing their movements, but then it also became a cue because of that. So there's all sorts of ways. What are your very first steps? Actually, the only things I'm going to consider the very first steps, and everyone does it different, is I just have to help which I'm doing now with the new guy, just help the horse understand your communication of the task. So the task being, what's the movement goal? What's the movement purpose? And that purpose often is just keep track of the target, right? Or look toward the target. So this is where I'll do pretty much normal positive reinforcement for a day or two. If they need to learn, okay, look at the target. You're going to touch it, but now I'm just going to reinforce just looking toward it because I do. Nobody needs to do it that way. I do because it's super easy. And that's often a default, is that my horses know if they're going around me, they're probably going to be looking toward me, which is also how I kind of work on straightness, right? I don't want them putting their shoulder to me and looking away. So that's one of the first things that I change, but I don't change it by asking their body parts to move differently. I do it by giving them a task where they're just like, I don't know what she's going to do. I got to keep track of that target. That's the game. If you don't want to keep track of the target, you're not playing. You can't play the game. And then I get the gym mat, do the carrot stretches on the gym mat. If the horse really is sort of downhill and we're going to ride him, so we need to get his spine able to lift against the rider, then I might start working on crunches. But like with Nemo, he's already pretty upright. I'm not going to ride him for probably 2 more years. So I'm probably not going to do crunches with him, maybe a slight weight shift, but that's easy enough because he actually just wants to go with you if you lean back a little bit. And then I personally always start with panther walk because I want to have something that's very high effort that I'm willing to reward for. It's really difficult, high effort. They have to coordinate all of their body, and it helps them eventually. That's the activity that helps them learn to be less on the forehand, because it starts by making them more on the forehand. But I always start with that. But there's no reason anyone needs to. Just I do, because it's just a super easy way to then have something you can go to in so many other situations. Okay, you got panther walk. Now you can do panther walk on a downhill slope. Woo, that's a whole new level of collection without ever touching them, right? Now you can do panther walk with a bend. Now you can do panther walk in your stall, which is really going to get them to be more upright. Like I see people holding the horse's head up in panther walk, and I'm like, no, don't do that. He obviously doesn't have a reason to, and his brain is saying don't. So we want to find a situation where his brain will say, oh, that down low head isn't going to work right now. So you do panther walk inside a stall, your horse is going to have to bring his head up. If that's something that you maybe think you're not getting enough variability. And that's where we do see a problem. So for example, if I see a horse that's really crooked, now remember, that's the brain's solution. But if he's persistently crooked in the same way, I'll say the crookedness is the brain's solution, but there is still a problem. But the movement problem is too low variability. The horse has a tiny, and so if he keeps solving everything this particular way, I know that a whole bunch of movements are just missing. So again, I'm going to approach it by expanding his movement toolkit, including sometimes exaggerating his already bad crookedness. That's a whole nother strategy, but to cause the nervous system to go, oh, when you make it that extreme, right? But again, not by touching his body, but by putting him in a situation where his natural default crookedness doesn't work, right? So you see, we do a lot of stuff on a slope. You put the horse sideways on a slope and you do the carrot stretches, he's going to find a point where that pushing leg needs to take more weight. But you don't have to tell him. His brain just goes, oh, and figures it out. So there's lots of explorations. And then everything else is just explore, explore, experiment, experiment. Movement novelty is the most important thing. So that's kind of one of the phrases that we have is different is better than better. So if you have enough different movements, and I don't mean cross training, I mean every stride is a little bit different. And every tiny bit of solution is a little bit different. That's where we give the brain so much rich information that it can start to optimize the movement. Because what people will naturally say, and this makes sense, well, I can't just let my horse figure it out because he's not. He's clearly moving badly and in the same way over and over again. Yes, but he's still moving the best way he can given the circumstances and what his brain knows about him. So we need to give the brain more information, and we can't do it by telling him how to move. So we need him to come up with it through exposure to lots and lots and lots. So the more we grow the toolkit, then what you see is movement systems are made to optimize movement to solve a problem. The only reason that we don't see it is because we often don't see a horse that has enough of a toolkit to do that. So, I mean, at a deeper level, right? The brain needs to do pattern matching, and it can't do that unless it has high exposure to a wide range for the same situation. So that's the part of nature that we're trusting. But we have to first expose the horse's nervous system to all those movements. And we do it by changing the environment and the specific task. And then we just explore, right? There's no way to know how any horse is going to react. And there's no way to know that the thing you do today is going to work the same way 3 months from now, right? So chasing the bag is a perfect example of something. Nobody has to do that. It can be very motivating, but we do it because it's usually a good way to get a kind of movement you don't normally get. And often a bigger movement with the front legs, for example, but just different movements, right? If the horse is trying to keep track of it, right? It's like he's chasing a cow. You know, you suddenly get this huge amount of variable movement, but not always at first. So Vavi, it took him 3 months before he would do it. But during those 3 months, I was doing other things, and I don't know which of those things flipped the switch. But at some point, I would bring out the bag every 2 weeks or something, and at some point, suddenly, whoop, it was all there. But it wasn't for those 3 months until something else somewhere in his movement system had changed enough that now those pieces came together. And it could be at some point his brain then said, you know what? Sure, I'm going to use all these resources to do this. Yeah, hell yeah. And then I know I've told this story for Vavi, the Pinto. Once he did that, it was night and day, overnight. The next day, my husband is like, Vavi's standing there in the pasture and he's going up to the horses and flicking his front leg and going, look what I can do. and he, because lifting their front leg and even slamming it down is a very rewarding thing for a horse to do for himself. And he had forgotten that he could, look like a stallion. And once he did, it changed his attitude, life, and movement. But that didn't happen overnight, that's for sure. Let's see. By the way, love you guys for watching and putting up with this. And I wouldn't blame everyone for leaving at this point, but I'm still here. So if you have questions, I will try to answer them. Let's see. Let's see. On movement purpose, can seeking out a feeling function as well as external movement purpose? I kind of think so. I think so. But I don't know exactly how to enable that, but you see it in Dramer, for example, but he's very mature in this. So he first started doing it, the showing off, was because he was basically angry with me. So, and that was the only emotion I was going to get. But he arched his neck and dissed me, and I said, that's what we're going to work with. That's the only way we're going to get that feeling. We're going to take that, right? It was an empowered feeling of movement, so I took it, which normally you would never have to do, but he was such a, it was life and death. But you see how, when he goes into the intrinsic motivation of that feeling, he's the most obvious because every part of his body changes, and you instantly see his ears because he's so grumpy. Most of the time he has a grumpy face. And he's volunteering, right? He's like, oh yeah, I want to do this, right? But then he'll be like, have the grumpy face, and he's trotting, and his ears are back, right? And then, on his own, he decides to, okay, now I'm going to bring it. And suddenly his whole face changes. His ears just start flopping, right? Everything just changes. And in that moment, now he's in nature's pharmacy. So he's already, because he's strong enough and skillful enough to do that hard thing and stay in it long enough to get some of that benefit. And that for him is a feeling, right? That's mimicking the feeling that he had when he would show off for, the neighbor's sheep or another horse or something. But it's easy to take advantage of that. And so one of the things I say is that a lot of times I show video, whether it's in the dojo or outside, where Dramer's just going around me, and he'll go into that, right? But that's not how I train. It's what I film because it's easy to film and the camera can just stay in one place. But if I did that all the time, there isn't a lot of purpose except for those moments where he's in the big thing. And very easily I'll see when, all right, just going big, which can definitely be an emotional movement purpose, stops being a movement purpose. And now he's just what we call phoning it in, right? He'll do it because it's not that hard, but he's not into it. And often that will be reflected in his movement, right? He'll be way more on the forehand, for example, or he'll be doing that canter I don't want to see just because it's not contributing to what we're going to do for riding, where he just artificially will throw his head up to lift his front legs up, right? And I want him to just canter. So, and I'll realize, because we're in this little circle, and unless he has a lot more energy and truly wants to show off, the hind legs aren't really in this game, right? He's just kind of faking it. So then I just go forward. I just go, let's go somewhere. So that's why the other sort of motto is, if you want the horse to do something, give him a reason. So if the horse isn't cantering, does he have a reason to cant? Not a behavior reason, right? Not a training reason, but a legit reason. And sometimes for horses that haven't moved fast in a long time, that reason is only because they're chasing other horses, or what I used to do, right, is if there's one moment and one moment only the horse will run, like when he's either being turned out or being called in for dinner or something, I'm going to position myself and to become part of that. They're not going to stop probably, but it starts to set up the long-term path if the horse isn't going to run. And sometimes it's hard to find reasons. You notice that we use a lot of tracks. I mean, it's part of our track system, but we use tracks like a long, narrow, skinny space the horse can run in or that we ride in. And those can be very motivating because the horse has a destination, because he knows, I'm going to the end. So they can just go. I don't have to micromanage. He's not waiting for me. He's like, oh, I got this. And then I can influence, the maybe the speed or what gait, but we're just going to go. I use the reverse triangle and the reverse rectangle instead of a reverse round pin, because each corner is a destination. And that is itself a movement purpose, right? Whereas the round pin is just keep going around. They're not really going anywhere. But if I'm going to that corner and then I know something's going to happen at that corner, then we automatically have an external focus on that corner. And that's where the research is unbelievably awesome and deep and robust. That having something out there to look at, or to move toward, or to hit the pool noodle, right? Instead of, hey, horse, lift your leg, right? That external focus of attention on something other than the body is so powerful. So you start to feel that when you don't have that. So if I start to feel the horse is kind of losing it, even if they're still phoning it in, which can look good if you don't know them, right? Then I just go, okay, this isn't, I got to go somewhere. We got to have a purpose. This isn't a purpose. Or maybe let's go do some obstacles or something. I don't use a lot of obstacles. I should do more. I just don't. I'll tell you my favorite new thing, I think. I mean, the horses have been on a really, really long break, but I'm planning to start doing this again. Is this thing that Katya, Sprinkle of Chaos, I think, came up with, which is just the small foam pad where you just throw it and the horse races after it, and then you can grab it and throw it again. That's turned out to be something all my horses really loved, and it's so easy because you can just throw it. So even if you can't keep up with the horse, that's a really fun way to get some movement and some bigger movement and faster movement. Yeah. Are you filming your process with your new boy? Yeah, I'm going to, for sure. I don't know how much I'll ever show, but I will document it because honestly, this is my first time with a horse that knows absolutely, well, nothing of this, but really nothing, period. He's the only horse I've ever worked with in my life that has not already been messed up by me, usually, or anyone else. So, and he's just awesome. So yeah, I'm going to film that. Has any of your horses ever shown a pee off? Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, to be honest, it's how Dramer kind of started doing his fancy trot. It was super easy to, he kind of, oh, I go up like this, right? And in fact, it was too much up. And if you're familiar with Icelandic sport, right, that is not the trot. That's not a competition trot. So a competition trot is really moving out and forward. So it wasn't the trot. I don't want pee off. There's nothing wrong with it. It could be a fun thing to do, but it's not what I wanted. So I wanted to, so it was difficult, actually more difficult. The ones he used to do looked very exaggerated. It either looked like a really exaggerated passage or pee off, and I didn't want that. So it was about moving it forward, but not losing, that the up. So kind of putting those two things together. But the dressage trainer at the time, she was like, well, we could just do pee off. And I'm like, no, that didn't have any purpose for me. But if I'd wanted it to, I don't know about my, Dramer's a 5-gaiter, but he has a lot of ability. I don't know. All my horses are 5-gated. It's, sometimes just trot is a big deal. But I've seen people do pee off on Icelandic horses. I looked happy and nice, but they can do it. And if you're prancing around on his own in the path, you often see a moment of it if they're engaged with another horse. You never see even a moment of it. I mean, it's in there. Do I have tips to optimize the horse's intrinsic motivation? Yeah, that's a big topic. It's a really important one, but if you just say, which I will say, yeah, definitely don't be doing so much reinforcement, but that's also the path to having a horse. If he has extrinsic motivation, that's also the way that the horse can just end up super frustrated. It's like, well, now I don't have any way to get the treat, right? And I don't even know what you want me to do. And that is how I train, right? I'm not saying anyone should ever do that, but that is how I train. The horse really doesn't have a lot of ideas of what exactly I want, right? When I'm doing movement training, very different from behavior, normal behavior that's not movement. I deliberately don't want him to be paying attention. So I'm going to withhold the clicks, but not to try to incrementally build duration. Normally, what I'm going to try to do is just withhold the clicks just so I don't break the chance for intrinsic motivation. But the main things that I do, and again, this is not how people should train. So it's very bad positive reinforcement that I do. I don't ever reward calm. I don't ever reward flat, normal, unenergetic movement for a variety of reasons. But this in no way means, and it's important that the horse learns, you're not saying it's bad to be calm. We want the horse to feel like it's great to be calm. It's just not what's going to earn reinforcement right now. And I think what most people come to find when they're doing really high effort movement with the horse, it doesn't start out this way for most horses. By the time they're doing a lot of high effort, they will automatically desperately want to take their own breaks, which a lot of times people will go, my horse takes longer breaks now before he gets back engaged. And it'll be like, well, that's probably because he's doing harder work. He's doing high intensity intervals and he needs to recover. When they're doing, crunches on the mat, they can just go and go and go, right? But once they do the big stuff, they need a break. And they will automatically, which is what I want. I want the horse to become calm, not because it's being reinforced. In fact, because I care so much about calm, that's the reason I don't reinforce it. Because I don't want it under extrinsic, external regulation. I want it to be something the nervous system chooses because he needs to rest and recover. But I don't do a lot of calm work with the horse because that's not what they need. You can't really do work and be calm if you're using the sort of technical definitions of, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. If they're in rest and relaxation mode, they absolutely cannot do hard exercise. The nervous system is either devoting its attention and resources to resting and digesting, or it's trying to get resources to the muscles and to the heart. And intrinsic motivation is the way that you get the good side of sympathetic nervous system without the really bad fight or flight, and you get some little freaky, awesome, a few aspects of, this situation where the horse is in kind of rest and digest mode. So we want to have the horse doing high effort. Now, high effort doesn't mean crazy big high energy. High effort can mean high coordination. So with Dreamer and Vavi, right, those are the energy saver horses. High effort usually with Yelfaxi, who has no problem with motivation to move. He just wants to throw his legs all over the place. For him to be really focused and concentrating on a very difficult panther walk downhill without just throwing his legs around, right? That for him is high effort. It's very hard coordination. So that's the puzzle I do with him most often. So I'm still reinforcing energy. And one of the ways that we reinforce high effort in a horse that doesn't seem to be doing much yet is at the moment of a transition. If you catch them at the moment of transition before they go into the next gait at a normal point. So for example, the horse is walking. Eventually he's starting to trot. He brings himself together. There's just a split second. And if you reinforce that and you give the treat for that, before the horse, now he's already in trot, but he's in a normal trot, I'm not going to reinforce that. But if you can catch it at the moment of the transition, now this is different from what some people might say, oh, you're reinforcing him for the idea. That's really not why we're doing it. We're reinforcing it because there is a metabolism spike at the moment of the transition, and that goes back down the moment they get into the next gait, unless the next gait is very high intensity. So if Dramer goes from walk and then into fancy trot, right? Well, now that whole trot I'm willing to reinforce. But if he's doing his fancy walk and then he just kind of goes into trot and then just falls out of it into, quote, normal trot, then what I want him to know is I'm totally happy with that normal trot. We're just going. I'm just going to wait for you. And it depends on the horse, right? If the horse responds really well to cues and pressure, some horses will enjoy that, right? And go, oh, hell yeah. Then I'll do that. Vavi, that would never work. So Vavi, I just go, hey, whenever you're ready. And then he'll decide when he finally is ready, brings himself together, right? But if they fall out of it, I'll just wait for them to pick it back up again, because they almost always will. So that's also how we often build duration. Not always, but with a lot of horses, people will get stuck in what we call the extrinsic loop, right? The horse does 3 fancy strides of that trot, and then if you don't click, he falls out of it. So then people are like, well, if I don't click, then he'll just stop doing even those 3 strides. So they get stuck where the horse gets frustrated if you don't click after the 3rd stride. So what we try to do is say, all right, he can do those 3 strides, not going to click, but we'll just keep going. Like, yeah, we're still in the game. We're still just doing it, right? It's like, and often they will go, oh, and they'll try one more time. And then the second time, now I'm going to reward it the first time he does it. And that starts to give you this long space where, yeah, only some of those moments were the big trot and the rest were this normal trot or whatever. But that's okay, because you still have this big duration, and that often starts to change the overall duration. So sometimes that's an easier way to get duration. We do that with everything, panther walk, all that. But yeah, intrinsic motivation, often the best motivation is another horse. Having other horses involved, not everyone has the ability to do that. But man, if you have a horse that doesn't have intrinsic motivation, it's worth trying to find a way to involve another horse, whether it's a person on a horse or another person with the horse somewhere, or sometimes you have a horse, just doesn't want to go big, but if he just happens to be next to another horse that's going big, it's there. So we take advantage of that a lot. Where do you draw the line between giving a cue and micro-shaping the movement? Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I don't want to give a cue until I know the horse already has the movement and that he emerged that movement not through micro-shaping. So I don't have a problem giving a cue for the movement that I already did not micro-shape. It does get a little bit tricky. I mean, crunches is the area where I kind of break my own rules. I make a few exceptions. But even, for example, like panther walk on the edge. So what we have to do is be careful that we're really trying to make sure that we're doing bad clicker training, that we are not doing successive approximation well, so that we're not shaping the movement. So if you go consciously try to make sure that you click for a completely different variation of that movement every single time, then you're much safer. That now you're getting a sort of more generalized movement from the beginning, which is what we want, because we don't want the horse thinking, I need to move my body parts this way because that's what will earn the treat. That's what we don't want. But we do want the horse to say, oh, I'm supposed to hit that pool noodle. Well, I'm going to want to see the horse hit that pool noodle or stomp on it or do in every way possible that he feels like doing it. But where it can get into trouble is that the horse will often be like very one-sided at first. He'll only do the panther walk with one leg up and not the other leg. Well, that's where you just have to get really creative and say, I'm not going to shape him to now do the other leg higher. I'm just going to keep moving the task in different ways and changing it in different terrain or different position of myself and just see. And at some point, it's probably going to happen. A lot of times, if you just start turning in a certain direction, right? So I'm just going to look for those affordances. But this gives me a chance, and I think I'm going to wrap this up now, is to give you probably what I think is the best advice that I wish I had known myself, would have saved me a lot of problems, which is just don't get stuck. You know, getting stuck would be on a particular movement or at a particular level of a movement. So, for example, you might have a movement where it has a lot of variability, but it just never gets bigger, faster, or something. Or you have a movement, like I said, like the panther walk is just stays with this one leg. If I started to see that this was going on for, a week or two, I would just stop doing the panther walk for a week or two and do completely different things. Because now you want to make sure that you're always introducing more novelty into the horse's movement system. Because it might be that his brain is just like, I don't think I should lift that leg up. But if you do it enough, if you keep repeating it, it's very easy to sort of bake in, especially if you're using positive reinforcement, it's easy to bake in where the horse, if he does it enough and gets reinforced for it enough in the similar way, the horse just starts thinking that is what you want. You want just that right leg to do this, but not this leg. So now they think that's the exercise. So the best way to just kind of deal with that is just don't get stuck. Is that if you start to see something that's starting to look too similar, right away introduce more novelty, more changes, more variability by varying the activity or the circumstances or the terrain or whatever, the location. And if that doesn't help right away, then just put that thing aside for a week or two, or however, like with Bobby, 3 months, right? And then try it again. So if I was stuck on 3 strides of fancy trot and then nothing, or 3 strides of the canter and then nothing, right? 3 strides of the big up canter apart and then nothing. If I can't very, very quickly have enough variation to change that, then I'll just stop doing it for a couple weeks. Let the neural circuitry start to do its thing, which is sort of detraining that exact movement. Let the pattern sort of settle down a little bit. And now you have a chance to introduce more novel movement. And then, try again, try differently. And there's nothing that I've ever seen that could not be undone. Because everything that you could do wrong with both traditional training and this, I'm quite certain that I've done in the worst possible ways. So I have so much faith in the resilience of horses because, and the resilience of just trusting nature and novelty, movement diversity, because I've made all those mistakes and things I thought I would never get out of. And you can have moments where the horse is so frustrated. 3 days later, he's totally fine. So what happens a lot is that we don't want the horse to be frustrated, so we just get stuck not letting him be frustrated. And we don't want him to be angry and dangerous, but a lot of the things that we're doing, they're hard. They're hard emotionally, mentally, and physically. But that's why we always do this. We don't do all of our work with autonomy, but anytime we're trying to change a movement, build a movement, have new movements emerge, total autonomy. He might have gear on, but the horse knows he doesn't have to do it. And the only way you can guarantee that the horse knows he doesn't have to do it is if you have already proven to him that in this location or in this context or with this gear or this person, this is a space where he will never be made to do the thing, where he doesn't have to respond to you. If you ask something and he doesn't do it in this location, that's fine. You might still have all of your other locations where here you don't have a choice, horse, but over here, This is where you are free to explore movement, and you will never be forced to do a movement that your brain says is risky, because that's never going to solve our problems. So once the horse knows that, and if you're using food, you have to make sure he's not hungry, because all we want is for the nervous system to not feel under threat or deep need. So if the horse is like desperate for the food, because his brain, remember, the horse is not being naughty. His brain is like, winter is coming. I must have food. So the horse is hungry and you have high value treats. Well, now the horse is going to get frustrated because his brain says, this is life or death. I might need that food. We might laugh about it and think, but every day he gets all the food he needs. But his brain is not on board. So if you have a horse that's really frustrated, and you're using food, I would make sure he has lots of hay even while you're training, if there's frustration. Use low value treats, all of that. But assuming that that's solved, because I don't ever want to be around a horse that's frustrated and hungry or thinking he needs the food. That would be dangerous to me. I just won't go there. But assuming that part's solved, now he's just frustrated because it's a hard game and he doesn't know the rules exactly. And it's, so only you can decide how far you can go with that. And I probably go way further than most people would or should in just how much frustration I'm willing to, permit. I guess I'm not really permitting it, but how much before I say, ooh, that was a little bit too much. Because it's part of what they've learned to do and part of what they need to do to be able to feel like they can cope. And frustration, I did action sports and some extreme sports for a long time. I was an athlete for a long time. A lot of the stuff I did that I loved, it wasn't fun exactly. It's intense and there's a lot of frustration in skill acquisition, and there should be, right? So for movement skill and to reach intrinsic motivation, they need to become skillful, and it will be difficult. But that's why autonomy is the absolute requirement, because otherwise I would never feel safe or even ethically comfortable making the horse do something in a movement if he thinks he has to. And has to would be because he thinks a request means if you don't do it, you're going to get hit. Or if he thinks that the food is too necessary. But if you've taken care of those things, yeah. So I guess I'm saying don't model anything after what I do. You can get ideas, but you should really look at the rest of the community, because that's what's awesome. There are people doing every variation of this that you can imagine, things that look very different from what I do, and things that I might not even agree with. And you should be exposed to all of those variations, as long as they follow the science, right? Then more exposure to more different people and more different horses is really, I think, how you get better at this. But mainly you just have to explore and experiment. This is just fun. I'm just experimenting. I might get nothing, but I'm exploring, and we're just going to keep exploring in different novel ways, and something will happen. Okay. You all are awesome for sticking this out for so long, if you're still here. And thank you. Thank you so much. And if you liked this, I'll maybe do another one that's shorter. Appreciate it. And bye for now.